Perfect. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We are so glad that you could join us today. My name is Robert Tyler. I work for BSC Group in New England, USA. In addition to this, I'm a volunteer serving as the SWS Ethics Committee Chair and a professional certified wetland scientist. I am pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar. Before I begin, I wish to extend a special thank you to Dr. Ritesh Kumar and Nancy Lynn of the SWS Ethics Committee, the SWS Webinar and Outreach Committees, as well as our MCI coordinator for the day, Madison Williams, for their assistance in making this happen. Today's topic is a professional ethics panel and discussion. Our panel today consists of Matthew Schweisberg, Marina Best, and Dr. Maria Sanders. I'd like to introduce each of them now. Marina Best serves as an associate director at the Society for Ecological Restoration, SER, currently on the secondment from Parks Canada since 2025. As a Mischief, am I pronouncing that correctly? Red River Métis woman. She pairs Indigenous knowledge with nearly a decade of experience at Parks Canada in various leadership roles, including manager of Indigenous conservation and manager of terrestrial archaeology East. Her work was focused on advancing respect for nature through fostering connections between people and building relationships with land, waters, and ice. In her role at SER, she is responsible for managing the staff, fostering the overachieving strategic direction of the organization to sustain biodiversity, improve resilience in changing climate, and reestablish an ecological healthy relationship between nature and culture. Thank you for joining us today, Maureen. Dr. Maria Sanders is an emeritus professor of philosophy at Plymouth State University, whose work brings philosophical ethics into conversation with law, community life, and the natural world. She holds a PhD in philosophy and a JD in law and an MBA in business administration. She is an applied ethicist with areas of specialization in medical ethics, legal ethics, and business ethics. Dr. Sanders' scholarship and public work focuses on the practical application of ethical reflection to contemporary challenges, including technology, community, well-being, and human flourishing. Her publications include books and essays on the philosophy and everyday life, critical thinking, and virtue ethics, including a book titled Mind the Gap: Exploring Happiness as a Community, which resulted from a year-long town-wide happiness course she led in the town of Plymouth, New Hampshire. Dr. Sanders has collaborated with community organizations such as the New Hampshire Audubon Society and the New Hampshire Humanities to facilitate programs exploring the relationship between ethics, community, and stewardship of the natural world. She has also hosted radio and television programs designed to bring philosophical ideas into community dialogue. As an ethicist on this panel for SWS, Dr. Sanders brings expertise in applied ethics and public engagement, offering a philosophical perspective on environmental stewardship, community responsibility, and the ethical dimensions of conservation. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sanders. Matthew Schweisberg is a retired federal wetlands ecologist and wildlife biologist with over 3 decades of experience in the Clean Water Act, Section 404 program. He spent more than 32 years with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Currently, Matthew serves as the SWS PCP, that's the Professional Certification Panel, Ethics Committee Chair. In addition to this role, Matthew is a principal for Wetland Strategies and Solution in Merrimack, Massachusetts, an associate for Burnside Environmental Group in Boston, and an instructor at Eagle Hill Institute in Steuben, Maine. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Massachusetts Area of Conservation Commissioners. Thank you for joining us as well. When he might hop on later, I believe, is the plan. Thank you guys. So with that, a couple of quick housekeeping things for everybody. Please direct any questions you have for speakers or scenarios that you wish to see discussed into the uh, Q&A section, not the chat section. Please keep the chat section open for technical difficulties. And if you wish to receive CEU credits for PWS or Whippet, please be sure to complete the survey, providing us with your feedback at the end of this webinar. Thank you guys all for joining us today. So with that, let me pull up my questions here. Why do I have too many screens? Classic 21st century problem there. So I guess we'll kick things off with Maria here. Wetland scientists are considered experts in their selected field. Given this, what ethical expectations can you see that they might have to wetlands, society, and to science in general, which would extend beyond that of the layperson?
Okay. So basically, because wetland scientists have specialized knowledge, they end up having a heightened level of responsibility when it comes to ethics. And this is true really of any profession that has an expertise in a particular area. The reason for that is knowledge aligns with power, and power gives us influence. And if we have greater influence, then we have greater ethical responsibility. So when I was thinking about the question that you shared, it really has three parts to it here. And the first part's asking about those responsibilities to the wetlands themselves. And this might initially seem like an odd question to some people, especially in the United States, because we tend to have this very anthropocentric view, with the exception of some of the indigenous cultures. But a predominant Western view is that the human being is the most important, and other things like wetlands get their value because of their uh, instrumental value to us, like how they benefit humans. But the mindset shift that really needs to happen, and it's one that I see embodied in your code of ethics for the Society of Wetland Scientists, is to view wetlands not within this context of anthropocentric value, so instrumental value, but more of an ecosystemic uh, perspective or mindset. And we see this a lot with indigenous cultures and a lot of the traditionally speaking Eastern cultures. And that's where the ecosystem, each aspect of it has value intrinsically, so in and of itself. And with that more ecosystemic mindset, the wetland scientist really does have an ethical responsibility to the wetlands themselves, to treating them with respect as if they have that equal value to a human being. That might mean um, shifting from more of a use and conserve mentality to a respectful mentality, a value and respect. So when it comes to um, if I can give some examples of some of the ways the wetland scientist has an ethical responsibility to the wetlands, advocating and conserving for the wetlands, striving to minimize harm during research. That might mean like avoiding damaging vegetation or soils or hydrology or wildlife habitats, that are in those areas. Promoting restoration. It's basically a respect for the ecological integrity of the wetlands. Now, the second part asks about ethical responsibilities that are owed to society. And here again, wetlands bring particular benefits to society at large. They control floods. They are responsible for water purification and biodiversity in our systems, climate regulation. So there's a lot of societal level benefits that come from wetlands. So that's why the ethical responsibility, that's kind of where the source of our ethical responsibility as wetland scientists originates. So what are some of the specific ethical responsibilities owed to society? Those would be things like providing accurate information, and this goes often beyond what's legally required. Ethics is a broader playground, so to speak. So sometimes we can meet the law and stay within the limits of the law and still be acting unethically. So when we're providing that accurate information, we're providing it in a very transparent way, and not just kind of trying to stay just on this side of the legal laws or where that line is in the sand. Informing policy and land use decisions. protecting public welfare, in general, educating the public, because the more educated the public is, it honestly comes full circle and makes the job for the wetland scientist easier as well, because they understand not only the legal responsibilities that the wetland scientist is operating within, but the ethical responsibilities that they also must abide by. And then the other one that I would note is avoiding conflicts of interest. This is always an interesting area too, because the smaller area that you're working in, the smaller the town or geographic area, you are going to run into conflicts. And not every conflict of interest is necessarily illegal or even unethical. But where it does become unethical is when it starts to taint the decision making and taint the view, or where it's not being shared transparently that you have this conflict, that all of these people and have other relationships with the people involved in the decision making. So all of that has to be very transparently shared. And in some cases, it does prevent the wetland scientist from doing that particular job if it's something that it's impossible to avoid the undue influence that the relationship would cause. And then the third part is a wetland scientist is a scientist. So they owe some ethical responsibilities to science at large. So the broader, being a member of the broader science, I should say. So here, this would include things like when you're conducting research, abiding by research ethics, integrity and accurate, not only data collection, but reporting. Again, that transparency comes back into play. Peer collaboration, ensuring that you have all of the essential experts at the table to give a very holistic, not only collection of information to make a well-informed decision, but also when we're sharing that out, that we bring all those various perspectives to the table, and acknowledging any uncertainty that we may have. That again, it comes back to that transparency.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, I really like how everything you're describing jumps into several of the efforts that we're trying to work on as you're describing, like to the wetlands themselves, that responsibility. It really makes me remember that SWS is a supporter of the Rights of Wetlands initiative, and
Mm.
that which calls for wetlands to be given legal rights similar to how humans have rights. Um, and I guess jumping off of that, in what ways can the ideals of this effort be incorporated into the ethics of wetland specialists?
Yeah, this is a large question because part of what you're up against here is a couple centuries of a mindset. So anytime you're trying to shift kind of a cultural view or perspective, that's going to move slowly. Now enter the legal profession into this. So I'll put my attorney cap on for a moment here. We're not really known for moving quickly. We tend to be a profession that change comes because we hold in very high regard tradition and built upon, a foundation from the past that can sometimes work against us. And so I think the largest hurdle that you're going to face in making this shift is really what I had kind of alluded to a few minutes ago, and that's trying to shift the mindset from this anthropocentric or human-centered view. Um, when I teach various ethics classes, and especially when we get into various case studies, whether it's dealing with environmental ethics or medical ethics or legal ethics or business ethics, any of these areas, when things tend to go really wrong is when we have on the receiving end of whatever that action is, something that's not being valued. Even the human on human cases, the cases that surface, it's usually because they have dehumanized that person. And what I mean by dehumanized is we've devalued because we tend to give humans value. Unfortunately, wetlands are already in that position for many people in the United States because they're seen as a thing, an it. So we don't typically view things as having that same level of value, that intrinsic value in and of its own sake. So I think that's going to be your greatest challenge is shifting that mindset, not just within the legal profession itself to sell the legality, the individuals involved in the process on the idea that wetlands should have rights as a, what I would use that term, person. We use the term in law person to mean humans with rights or things with legal rights. And I put the or things in there. There's a few exceptions. You're not breaking brand new territory. If you think about corporations have legal standing, they have a legal right, but it's because of their value to humans. So they haven't really sidestepped that anthropocentric view yet. Even some humans, minors, they don't have the same legal rights that adults have within our legal system. Non-human animals, some count, some don't count, in our legal system. And so that's the battle you're up against. And it's one that not only do I personally believe in, I'm willing to go up that mountain with you, but it is something you have to understand. It's going to take a lot of persistence, because it's not just simply a change in law that you're advocating for here. It's a shift in mindset that you're advocating for. So that's going to take, it's going to take time, and it's going to take, I think, educating the broader public so that you have that support behind you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a mindset shift there. Marina, I would be curious if you have any thoughts on either of those questions, given both your personal background and SER's constant push to restore the natural world.
Yeah, thank you. And I could listen to Dr. Sanders talk all day. It's so beautiful. I think for the first question that was asked, yeah, what you said, Dr. Sanders, completely resonates with, again, just my identity as an Indigenous person and my experience working within this realm. I think for wetland scientists, it's a good way to shift your mindset of thinking yourselves as experts, but rather as stewards or guardians instead, because that really is a means of shifting from that anthropocentric perspective and really viewing everything as interconnected. Because again, I can't speak for all Indigenous cultures, but for a large part of them, that is something that is really intrinsic to those values and cultural perspectives is that everything is interconnected. So ourselves as people are connected with the lands and waters. And so shifting that responsibility to, a broader scope will allow the responsibility to wetlands, to science, to society to all come together because we're all an interconnected system working for each other. So it shifts us from those different pillars or whatever you would want to call them to something that is a system working with itself. And so I think from my experience, if you can see yourself in a different light, that allows you to have a different perspective on what your responsibilities might be as a wetland scientist. And I do think that kind of shifting to the legal rights question on the rights of wetlands, it also enables you to understand that these initiatives like that mirror what has been done through the broader Rights of Nature initiative, which again is really fostered through the Indigenous ways of knowing. And I think giving voices to nature in all aspects is what Indigenous peoples around the world have been trying to do and emphasize time and time again. So by elevating wetlands as a rights holder creates those enforceable obligations, but it deepens the duty of care and advocacy that a wetland scientist would have. So again, it shifts that role from a scientist or expert to really a guardian perspective. And I think that is the importance of where we need to go, that pathway that Dr. Sanders was talking about. And so perhaps that would just be helpful with regard to shifting the mindsets of what has been kind of drilled in for decades, if not longer than that.
No, I appreciate your background and your input on that. It's invaluable to have that level of insight. It does kind of feed me into another question I had, which was the theme of this year's World Wetlands Day was celebrating the cultural heritage through wetlands. And I guess for both of you guys, but Marina, if you want to start us off here, uh, how has your culture personally impacted your ethics, and how should you believe that how should cultures around the world impact ethical frameworks for wetland science or even ecological science in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, culture has a significant impact on my personal ethics, my community ethics, because it creates that centering of what is considered right and wrong, who is responsible, and how everything, again, as I mentioned before, relates or interconnects with one another. For me and my community, and again, this is very similar to many indigenous cultures, but again, they're not the same. They're very diverse, but we see Mother Earth as part of our relations. So it's something to be cared for rather than a source of resources. This kind of gets back to what Dr. Sanders was saying about that perspective of, this is something that's useful to us, but rather we need to take care of it. We have that obligation to take care of it. So when thinking about the gifts of Mother Earth, there is a need for that reciprocity and giving back. So everything should be cyclical and not just one directional or transactional, I guess you could call it. And Indigenous ethics is rooted in a way of thinking that sees time, relationships, and responsibility very differently than the more typically Western frameworks that Dr. Sanders was talking about. And we're not in a lot of those mindsets focusing on the present moment or the individual. We place Indigenous worldviews in like a long chain of ancestors and future generations. Many communities, you may have heard of that, think of like 7 generations in the future and 7 generations in the past. Again, that looks different from community to community, but there's that web of relationships, and that includes land, water, plants, animals, spirits, things like that. And again, it's this big, long chain that you're considering when you're, having just something to do at work or you're considering an action because there's that impact, there's that ripple effect. And I do think that that interconnectedness and consideration of different people other than yourselves again helps emphasize what responsibility you have that goes beyond just the present moment, the site that you're working on, the project. You have to have a broader focus to that, and something that I think is worthwhile to reference here when considering how, because I think maybe a lot of you may not be Indigenous and you're like, well, how do I, have this consideration of these different ways of knowing or being with regard to my work. And there are things out there. So there are ethical research frameworks that exist out there. Again, I'm not very familiar with exactly all exist in the United States, but in Canada, there's something called the First Nations Principles of OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession of information. And that's something I can put it in the chat later if you want to take a look at that. But there's actually training that exists out there, and it's done by First Nations people in Canada, and it addresses historical research harms by requiring that data collection and use follow community-defined protocols and respect Indigenous self-determination. So there's things out there that can help guide you. Like I'm working on a project, and there might be some Indigenous communities that are involved or would be affected or interested in what's going on. Being able to elevate yourself as a wetland scientist and understand, I need to have some things in mind. I don't need to be an expert in it. You're not expected to do that, but you need to have awareness of again, these different ways of knowing and how the impacts of the work that you're doing may affect others. And so there are guidance out there that can help you do that in a way that, again, is more relationship based or respecting sovereignty of these different Indigenous nations. And I do think that it's always, again, things are always changing. There's more information that comes out, but there are useful resources that can help you in that and better understand what things you should be considerate of when you're doing this type of work. And it might help you, again, understand, as what we were saying before, these different perspectives that might be slightly different than how you had viewed yourself, your role, and your responsibilities. Hopefully that
No,
answers the question, Robert.
yeah, no, that's amazing. As you were speaking through that and you're talking like connections to the bigger world, I remember like some early surveys I'd helped with on military installations here in the US, and they would have these large training grounds, and those grounds would wind up becoming effectively nature sanctuaries as when they weren't being used for training. And it was always remembering like that the land was more than just what the designated purpose was for it. And it was, it's a slightly different culture, a very different culture, but background there was kind of cool. I guess I'm curious as you're talking about elevating yourself as well. Many wetland scientists, including myself, are consultants. And with that, we often not only have to elevate our own person to further our project goals to include everything that we're discussing today, but also educate our clients through that. Would you have any advice on how to raise these topics or guidance on bringing this information toward clients?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so maybe something that I haven't woven in at this point is so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Society for Ecological Restoration. So as Robert mentioned in my introduction, I'm the associate director with SCR, as we call it. So just for some context for what I will be speaking about, it might be helpful to understand where I'm coming from. But we are a membership organization that was founded in 1988 by practitioners and researchers, and we advance the science, practice, and policy of ecological restoration to sustain biodiversity, improve resilience in a changing climate, and reestablish an ecologically healthy relationship between culture and nature. So as a membership organization, we have a number of different people working around the world. We have over 5,000 different members from many different countries, and they work in different consulting roles. They work with, government organizations, things like that. And through all of the knowledge that we have been able to put together, we have created the principles and standards for ecological restoration. So the background on that is that all of you and beyond have worked over many, many years in a way that was able to be compiled into these principles and standards. And many of the things that we've talked about thus far are included within those different components. So again, thinking about that larger scope of how to work with others, how to be considerate of different types of knowledge, that's all within the standards. And it is being updated for its third version as we speak, but I can also put in the chat the links to the current second version. But as a wetland scientist, when you have these different resources like the principles and standards, it creates kind of a baseline expectation of what you're working towards. So then when working with others, other organizations that, again, might not necessarily have that same hat on or expertise, or again, their interests lie elsewhere, it really helps you as a consultant showcase, this is what I'm working towards. This is, my ethical standard. And these are the things that I need to be considerate of. And I do feel like when being a consultant, it does help people on the other side understand, oh, okay, this is within the scope of their responsibilities. This is something that they need to do. So when there are differences amongst, you're coming into terms with what the project might want to do versus what you as a wetland scientist are seeing as the needs from an ethical perspective, it can kind of help you ensure that these different social or maybe science focused aspects or those to society or whatever it might be, whatever we talked about in the first question, are being kind of underscored by something that is widely accepted. I think the standards have been cited over 100,000 times or something ridiculous like that. So again, hopefully that is answering that question. But when you do have those different standards, it upholds that high professional, scientific, social, ecological baseline for which you're working that can then make your role as a consultant easier because that's ultimately your guidebook.
I really like that approach of making a standard and taking that and being like, listen, these are the standards that I try to follow. So in doing that, this helps me to elevate those ideas or express those to other interested parties on any project. That's very cool. And I will say that the uh, principle or the the standards that you guys set with SER, I remember studying those in school and still using them on projects today. So I'm excited to see what the new panel or the new standards will look like as they're getting updated. Um, moving forward from that, this is the question I have a feeling we'll probably get some things moving in the Q&A section. Um, have you guys ever encountered scenarios where your personal ethics might have come in contrast with a goal or an initiative of your own? And if so, how did you navigate this situation?
Would you like Maria or myself to start?
Uh, Marina, if you want to keep going, and then I'll have Maria answer. This one's one I got for all of you guys.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm less in the environmental ethics. I'm new to that arena, so more of my examples are going to come from medical ethics, legal ethics. But I've got loads of hypotheticals for you where I can see the conflict. So, Marina, you would probably be better for this one.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I feel like everybody on the call has been in this scenario where, your personal ethics have contrasted with a certain goal or initiative. I feel like I was alluding to that perhaps in the previous question. And I do feel like it is very challenging, especially when, the sake of your job depends on you doing this work that people are expecting of you. But I do feel like if you are putting on that hat as you are a guardian of this, ecosystem of this larger interconnected space, it does make it easier for you to flag things when they're just not sitting with you. Depending on if those are conflicting with something on like the morality side, you just want to raise them because that's something that is concerning you personally. But ultimately, if there's something that is coming up with, this isn't sitting quite right based on perhaps what you read in the SER principles and standards or something like that, it is something where I feel like as a guardian, you have that obligation to communicate the concerns that you're feeling and ensure that they are heard and understood and captured. And what Marie was saying before, there's some instances like conflict of interest where it might not necessarily be an issue, but having that transparency is really important. So making sure that you're communicating those is really, really important. And so it is a professional responsibility to flag when something is off. And I think in some cases, you should be prepared to walk away. There's no need to compromise your integrity. And as scientists, all you have is your integrity. And once that is tarnished, it's really hard to get that back. And because you are a guardian or steward at your core, you just can't live with that. And I think in my personal situation, I haven't had the I haven't come across the situation where I've had to walk away, but I have had situations where I've had to communicate, hey, we need to be considering, the rights and interests of this community, or we need to be doing X, Y, and Z. And I do feel like because of those opportunities where I've been able to voice those things, it has been a ripple of change. And we have seen things, take different, for instance, Indigenous rights into consideration in the future. So I do think that there's opportunities that can come when you do communicate these concerns that might not exist that can make things easier for other people when they might be facing the same situation in the future. So although you might be in a very uncomfortable position, it is worth it to flag it and retain your integrity and also ensure that what you're doing does not have any detrimental effects for the ecosystem as a whole, the society, the people, plants, animals, etc. Um, Dr. Sanders, did you have anything to add on that?
First of all, I love everything that you just said. But a couple things that I would add on top of that, and this goes in line with what Marina was saying about protecting your reputation and your integrity. Think long term. A lot of times when we're tempted, especially in those areas where there are conflicts of interest, where we may be tempted to uh, look towards the short term either payoff or relationship with a particular client or particular job that you're engaged in, concerns that you're going to lose that job. Think much more long term than that, because if you truly stay in a situation where you should have walked away from it, destroying that personal reputation and losing your personal integrity will probably keep you out of doing what you want to do for a lifetime rather than a job or two. So that's one of the pieces of advice I always give my clients as well as my students, is whenever you're really being torn in two directions, that's usually what they call that little angel, little devil on each shoulder. If you push it out and think long term, a lot of times that proper voice resounds a little louder when you look at that big picture. The other thing, and this is one of my own personal initiatives, is I really would like to see um, at all levels, not just with scientists, but also, consultants and so forth, consider bringing more applied ethicists to the table. We bring a perspective that really is about being morally robust, socially responsible, and in the case of wetland scientists, we can often identify hidden assumptions because we are an external perspective. Coming at this is one of the things that really drew me to even being on this panel. As I shared a few moments ago, I'm an applied ethicist, but my areas for about the last 4 decades have largely been within medical ethics, legal ethics, and business ethics. And I'm relatively new to the environmental ethics portion of applied ethics. But I have to tell you, it's very easy for me. It was easy to move from medical ethics to business ethics and then to legal ethics and now to environmental ethics, because a lot of what we do is bringing that broader external perspective to the hidden biases that might be in a decision making process. We also do a deep dive because we've studied not only on the Western traditions of philosophy, to roughly about the 6th century BCE, but the Eastern traditions as well. So we have a lot of these philosophies that a lot of what we think we're recreating or we're building that's new today has been done so many times in the past. And so being able to tap in to that knowledge base is also very useful. So clarifying your moral dimensions, thinking about it, and that's always the first step, being aware of what these potential moral dimensions might be in the task at hand or the job that you're undertaking. Um, Analyzing value conflicts, but even beyond that, ensuring that you're always consistent in your ethical decision making, but also your behaviors. I will say, in the long run, especially from the perspective of community members, the community at large, they will pay more attention to how you behave than what you say. So, if you really want to educate the general public, be the person you want them to be, behave the way you want them to behave. They're going to follow your lead on that. I think there's that very famous quote that's been attributed to multiple people, but the idea that people rarely remember what you say to them, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. The same is true here. That if you're mirroring the behaviors that you would like to see in your profession, that's the quickest way to educate the public regarding those behaviors.
Nice. I appreciate that. There's a question that came into the chat that's a bit of a follow-up on this one that it touches on a little bit. I can understand the sensitivity around this one. Given the current geopolitical climate, how would one necessarily contend with their personal ethics in a, I'm trying to phrase this one carefully. How can one stand for their personal ethics when the world around them might be shifting? And I'm not sure who might be best for this one, but uh, I did think it was interesting that they were factoring in the current geopolitical climates and how it can sometimes feel like the protections afforded to wetlands and the environment in general are occasionally feel undermined. Um, and that how do we come to terms with that? Is there something that can help us with that?
Well, I can weigh in initially on this. First of all, yes, I fully hear the question you're asking and all of its undertones, and it's a reality right now, unfortunately. I think I do a lot of work with communities. In fact, that's been really at the nexus of all of my work. Is I tend to um, enjoy being amongst the community, but I can also tell you that recently I face a lot of what the concerns are that you're raising here. Um, I think there are a couple things that you can do. What I have found first and foremost is for myself, getting accurate as well as sharing accurate information on the differences between perceptions, beliefs of the few, and the behaviors and beliefs of the many. Quite often, uh, what we're up against right now is the actions and the beliefs of a small number of people that tend to have a lot of power. That's what we're facing. So where the resistance really lies is in numbers. People are scared right now, is what it comes down to. And what I have found when I'm out and amongst the community is the more we listen to each other, not just hear each other, but truly listen and share accurate behaviors. I'm going to share an example here that really is outside of wetland science area, but I think it applies. There was a very relevant study done in the United States here at Stanford University on happiness, where they became aware that many of their students, and this is true, by the way, the World Happiness Report has just released this data as well, that this is true worldwide. We tend to have lower perceptions of the benevolence of other people and how other people will step in and help or act or behave in situations than what the reality has shown us in experiments. And they started a lot of this looking at like dropped wallet studies around the globe. If I lose my wallet, what are the chances it would get returned? And what they realized, people's perceptions were much lower that people would return the wallet than what was actually the case when they did the studies. And I think the same is true in all areas, including what you're facing within the wetland science area. What Stanford University did, and it was a very simple response to this, is they made posters and hung them around campus just showing the actual data around the behavior. Here's the percentage, and I apologize, I don't have the percentages off the top of my head. I didn't know I was going to share this case. But here's the percentage of students that want to help other students. Here's the percentage of students that would like to be your friend, would like for you to walk up. So just sharing the actual information that this pushback that's happening quite often at a relatively higher powerful level isn't shared amongst the broader communities. Um, the stronger that joint voice gets, and this is where lying and educating the public is going to work to your benefit, the more they understand not only what you're up against as a wetland scientist or as a consultant in this arena or a practitioner in this area, but also the benefits that they risk losing by losing the wetlands themselves. Again, going back to viewing the wetlands as having their own intrinsic value, the broader we can spread that message, the more you're going to have the numbers on your side, and that can offset a lot of what the current climate. I know it's not a short-term solution, and I wish I had that for you. But I do think from a community perspective, that's where the community can step up and help you. So I would look broader than just maybe the other scientists beside you. Get your community involved, that they can actually be one of your greatest assets.
I appreciate that, especially just with everything. It can feel overwhelming, and reminding people that that community and that education can help to change the reality is huge. Um, the another individual has dug further into that, where what I guess is happening in their situation is ethically what they are being told to do is wrong in their opinion, but that their job requires that they meet current regulations or rules which don't necessarily match up with either beliefs or science. And I understand that this might be a sensitive question. How would you advise they might address this? I do feel that this is one that's worth mentioning, even though the sensitivity around it can be tricky.
I can maybe quickly speak to this, and then if Dr. Sanders has something to add, that would be great. But I think what came to mind when you were speaking, Dr. Sanders, and just within the context of this additional question, is I do think this is one of those situations where professional standards, like the SCR principles and standards, can give you that defensible ethical foundation when regulations are forcing you to limit what you can say, because these different standards or principles require you to uphold accuracy, transparency, and integrity, even within that constrained framework. So, by grounding your work within those standards, I think you would be able to meet legal requirements while still documenting any scientific limitations, uncertainties, or omissions in a way that protects your credibility. And signals where the science points without necessarily violating the rules. So, for instance, which I think you were alluding to, and now I've lost your question, but I think if you were told not to include certain things or environmental information, I feel like, and I don't know the specifics of your situation, but perhaps professional standards can still guide you to act ethically by requiring you how to present, what is allowed. Um, so they give you that basis to document, again, those limitations or note where something is incomplete. And I feel like that might be an angle to take. And when speaking about that community aspect, again, like this group here, the Society for Wetland Scientists or the Society for Ecological Restoration, like if you don't necessarily have that community beside you, as Dr. Sanders was saying, there are these societies that exist of people facing the same situations, and they can be a great resource, to have those conversations and really try and figure out what others are doing in these similar situations. But perhaps what I had shared regarding the standards and being able to provide that as, again, a framework or baseline that you're working towards can help you when you're facing these types of issues. But Dr. Sanders, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I just pulled here because I had pulled my standard kind of ethics guide in preparation for this panel discussion. And this is one that really, we face these similar sort of issues again in all the various applied ethics areas. And first point of advice that I would give you is don't go it alone. I know it can really feel like you're the only one dealing with this and you're out there, and Marina's alluded to this as well. You know, you have not only a set of standards that you can use as a guideline, but you have a professional organization to back you as well. I mean, you have colleagues that are going to agree with you. And when you're faced with the ones that perhaps are in conflict with you at this point, or they don't share your views, those voices again can sound louder than the others. But what we always recommend from an applied ethics side is have a clear step-by-step plan in mind. Um, if time is not of the essence, which most of the time it's not, we tend to feel urgency where it doesn't exist in many of these ethical conflicts because they have an emotional level to them as well. But you really want to keep that rational side in control. And so the first thing I would advise is this a time of the essence sort of situation where you have to make a decision right now? If not, then take some time and really think it through. The first step, identify, and I would recommend writing it out. There's something valuable in seeing it in print, is write out what you see as the ethical conflicts that are occurring. And once you've defined clearly what you see as these ethical issues at play, reach out to professional societies that you belong to, reach out to trusted colleagues that you can get their perspective. I would reach out again beyond, if you're a wetland scientist, go beyond wetland scientists. If you're a consultant, go beyond consultants. In other words, get outside your inner circle and get some perspectives as to, hey, here's what I'm dealing with. What would you do if you're in my position? Because whenever there's truly an ethical dilemma, there's not a simple solution for it. And often there's not one solution, there's multiples when we take the time to really think through it. But there's not going to be a low lying fruit. If so, you would have picked it and moved on. So these are very real and they're tough to deal with. So once you get these perspectives from multiple people, sit down and run your consequence lists, of the various things that are being suggested. Look at where the legality of the situation lies, because again, um, I don't want to say you never want to break the law. It might sound odd for an attorney to say that, but I also have studied the folks like Socrates and Plato. And, there's times where we're willing to fall on the sword. Just make sure if you're going to go up against something that is going to put you in a position where you're breaking a law, that you're willing to fall on the sword, because you're probably going to. When our personal ethics conflict with our professional ethics, unfortunately, as an applied ethicist, what I always advise my students is find a different profession, because the professional ethics have to outweigh in your actions and your behaviors. When you're part of, like, say you're certified, you're going to lose your certification. If you're in a professional organization, and again, whether it's within environmental ethics, medical ethics, legal ethics, as a lawyer, I violate my code of ethics, I'm disbarred, so you're not in the profession anymore. So it's an uncomfortable thing to think about, but truly, if you constantly come up against it, you might be in the wrong profession. If it's something more recent because there have been changes in laws, again, what we were alluding to in the previous question here, that's where I think reaching out, getting these start to gather your people. I mean, I can't say enough, come back together. Community is where you're going to have your power. Individually, it's like any animal out in the wild. The one that's out there on their own is the easier one to pick off. If you're in the herd, you have some protection there. So if you are in a situation where your personal ethics are conflicting with what you're being asked to do, and you're really on the right side of things with your personal ethics, there are going to be other people that want to be a part of your herd. I would gather that herd together, and don't go it alone.
I
I wish I had something that was a little more here right now, but it's not going to be easy, low-lying fruit with these kind of situations.
No, it's I feel like a lot in life it's helpful to just remember that you're not alone. It's that having that even non-professional, having that friend that you can call, having that family member you can call or whatnot is huge in everything. And then when you start getting into these ethical dilemmas, like remembering that you're part of a group is very helpful. Um, I do like how you brought up like the professional certifications can play a role in how you're deciding things. And given that Matt has unfortunately not joined us yet, Marina, I know SER offers their certified ecological restoration practitioner CERP thing. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to what roles ethics can play in a professional certification.
Yeah, of course. So again, we had talked about earlier the a status of as a wetland scientist having that baseline for an ethical bar, whatever you'd want to call it. But professional certification definitely raises that bar because it elevates the trust, accountability, and responsibility of the practitioner. So certification helps give confidence that these scientists can be trusted with decisions that affect land, water, ecosystems, and people. And for SER, our Certified Ecological Practitioner, or CERP, as we call it, CERP, are expected to have a significant foundation of knowledge and experience, but also participate in ongoing learning. So it's not just when you get a certification that you're one and done, but it's something that is an ongoing process where you need to submit ongoing learning to be recertified. And maybe this is again, Dr. Sanders, I don't know the background of where you're working, but again, you need to be very cognizant the entire time that you have this certification that there are there is the potential for it to be taken away from you in many different aspects. So there is an expectation that our SERPs at SER are at the forefront of best practices within the field of ecological restoration. So again, that's that ongoing learning, that consistent application to the SER code of standards. And they need to be abiding by the SER code of standards as part of their initial application. So before they're even actually certified, it's a part of their obligation. So it codifies it to these SERPs, that there's that expectation that they're meeting these certain standards of ethics within SER. And so again, from my perspective, just coming back to the question, as practitioners in this space, if you're getting additional certification, there are other obligations and expectations that are above and beyond just the standards. And those are things that you need to be aware of and keep in mind, because that accountability and expectations on you is going to be higher if people are aware that you have this certification. Hopefully that's answering your question within the context. I'm not sure what Matthew would have said to it, but
No, it is, and I'll do a shameless plug for next month's webinar where on the new opportunities in professional wetland certification. I just had a colleague remind me about this, and that they will be speaking about the PWS specific ethics around a professional wetland certification or a wetland practitioner in training certification as part of that. So please feel free to attend that, or send any of your new scientists to attend that one as well. Um, so there's another question that popped into the chat, Marina, that I think you might be particularly well suited to answer, and it's there's often a lesser of two evils scenario to choose with regard to the impacts or resource usage versus binary choice. How would you consider when the lesser impact is still not acceptable? And I know that this comes up in restoration a fair bit.
that's a great question. And I sent the SERP link for everyone's reference to be sent into the chat. So hopefully you're able to see that. Oh wow, that's a really interesting question. I think there's there's no necessary easy answer to this. I think it's um, really necessary to acknowledge that the lesser evil choice is still harmful, and it's okay to refuse to treat it as acceptable or as a neutral choice. So um, it's something that you can take on, that responsibility of like documenting the limitations or the impacts honestly, and advocate for alternatives. As Dr. Sanders was saying, we have this pressure always that, decisions are urgent and things need to be done immediately. But if this means, like, if you're facing a situation where really taking some additional time to find an even less harmful path forward, like that is the time that it really needs to take. And I think that you should advocate for that in your role and not necessarily succumb to that pressure. I think as if I'm looking at the right question in the Q&A, it's referenced that somebody else will usually do what you don't want to do. And yes, that's true. And I think that's really putting you in that position where you need to advocate that is not an easy decision, and really try and transparently articulate what some of those issues are. And even if someone else proceeds with what you were asked to do, maintaining your integrity keeps the ethical problem visible rather than allowing it to just disappear into routine practice. And I do think a way of thinking about this is that ethical decision making isn't just about the choice you make, but the process that you follow. So I think, again, being able to document everything, being transparent as possible, show where harms maybe remain unresolved is really important to being aware of like your own limitations. And also being able to keep yourself within that ethical boundary that makes you feel comfortable. Hopefully that is answering the question. I'm not sure if Dr. Sanders has anything to add on that.
Well, I just want to say I love that you brought in the process and the importance of that, because we can chip away at our own personal integrity and our individual reputations in such small little increments that it doesn't seem like such a big deal at all, when it's happening. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're really not liking the person that's looking back at you in the mirror. And at the end of the day, that's what's really important, that these decisions we're making. And I agree. There often is someone else is going to step up and be willing to do what you're not willing to do. But if we allow our own kind of character to be chipped away like that in small ways, um, you'll end up with bigger issues. And again, I'm thinking of the other side of the house that I work on, and it's a lot of around this concept of eudaimonia and living full and flourishing lives. Most of the individuals that I'm dealing with that I work with look very successful externally, and internally they are so lost and devastated. They're in states of despair. We have globally higher uh, loneliness and despair ratings, especially amongst our youth, than we've ever seen in the past. And a lot of it has occurred in this way, where we get too focused on the final decisions or even the short-term goals, and we chip away by not focusing on the processes that are leading to those goals. We chip away at our own character without even realizing it. So that's, I know, a very philosophical offshoot of this question, but that is what comes to mind when I'm listening to Marina talk. It's like, it's so important to include that process in your analysis and not just the end goal. That this particular job, you might lose, but if in the long run you're not losing yourself, you've kind of won, so take that for what it's worth, I guess, in our current environment.
No, I appreciate that. That's remembering that you have to keep yourself true to yourself as well as true to your role is very important. I do feel like this question kind of starts to ease out what probably should have been our first question in hindsight is if we could speak to the difference between ethics and morality, because it feels like we're starting to touch on that difference just a little bit. And Maria, you might be really good suited to continue with this one.
Let me unmute here. These two terms are very closely related, and a lot of times people use them interchangeably, but they are different in meaning. Morality is more personal and individual. So we do at times talk about morality in the context of society, like social beliefs, but more often than not, it's a person's beliefs. It's an individual, and it's influenced by multiple things, really. Your upbringing, um, the society itself, social norms can influence it. Religious and spiritual beliefs influence our morals. And it's not unusual for our morals to conflict with other people. For example, let's say within wetland science, a scenario here, you may have a farmer who has personal beliefs that it's okay to drain part of a wetland in order to expand his crops and feed his family or maybe his local community. Whereas another individual, let's say maybe it's an advocate for wetlands, feels it's never okay to drain any portion of a wetland. So they each have their own personal beliefs there, and they're in conflict, but those would be considered within the realm of morality. And when we talk about morals, ethics deal more with what Marina was talking about at length, and that involves professional codes of conduct. So a lot of times, I know Society of Wetland Scientists has a code of ethics. Most professions have a code of ethics. And that code of ethics is really where most of conceptually ethics lies. So it's going to involve things like a professional community. And this is why I said earlier, you don't have to go it alone, because if you're part of a profession, you have a code of ethics that gives you guidance. You have a professional community that can give you support. It ensures that there is fairness and integrity and accountability, a lot of these things we've been talking about. So morality, think of it more as personal, individual. Ethics is more in a way, external, dealing with a profession, a group. Um, you can have conflicts in ethics as well. Unfortunately, by the time you have ethical conflicts, they're often ethical dilemmas. And a few of the examples we were just discussing would classify as ethical dilemmas. Because again, there usually aren't real easy solutions, because those would be the ones that are already codified in your code of ethics. But that code of ethics can still guide you through them. So again, think of it more as how personal or individual it is versus is this tied to a profession and professional codes of conduct.
I, I I particularly like how you highlighted the conflicting morality structures or conflicting interest groups even could come about because that comes up on every job site. And I'm sure, Marina, you see that in the restoration world as well, where it's everybody, even a project might have a different goal from what one goal wants. Both want to see it restored, but maybe for different reasons. I've frequently seen that where it's like, you want this restored for waterfowl, or do you want this restored for plants? And that can completely change how you do a project. So I really appreciate that input. We had a question here that was this one actually came from one of the other ethics committee members, and I particularly like this one. And it was, what are the boundaries of ethics that is relevant to SWS? Should we consider ethics in light of our role as an SWS member, or in light of our broader role as wetland scientists slash practitioners? So, Maria, I'm wondering with that external view that you were highlighting earlier, like where should we think of that?
Okay, if I'm understanding the question correctly here, you're drawing the boundaries, comparing it from an individual, like a wetland scientist, as a member versus the whole profession?
Correct.
Okay. Usually, when personal ethics are conflicting with, say, like a code of ethics, if I have a personal belief that's in conflict with my professional code of ethics, the standard rule of thumb is you should be abiding by your code of ethics. And again, this is where I know I mentioned briefly earlier, if you find that happening on a consistent, regular basis, that's usually a sign you're in the wrong profession. Because from a legal standpoint, codes of ethics are not the same as laws, but in many ways, in a practical setting, they get treated like such. Because I know in the United States, if I'm in a profession that has a code of ethics and I'm in violation of that code, and let's say I end up in court, the first thing that the attorneys and the judge are going to look at is your code of ethics. And we have what's called a reasonable person standard. And in this case, it would be applied to a reasonable person in this position, so in this profession. So if I'm the judge in a case that something has blown up and gone terribly wrong, and now you, as an individual wetland scientist, is in my court, one of the first things that's going to be asked is, how would a reasonable person in your position have acted? Did you go rogue, or did you behave like a typical wetland scientist in your profession? So keep in mind, these codes of ethics and professions in general, what they do is they give a consistency to the profession. It gives a credibility, as well as an accountability. It holds those professionals accountable. The codes of ethics are internally created. Like, your profession creates your code of ethics. And from a legal standpoint, there's an expectation that you're going to enforce your code of ethics because you're the ones that came up with them. Now, again, you cannot come up with ethical principles that are in conflict with legal laws, which is why you'll see in most codes there's some statement that says, and they'll abide by legal laws. But beyond that, there's a lot that legal laws don't address. And so as an individual, and you will have times probably where your personal beliefs will conflict with your professional code. When that happens, again, the advice I would give is you should be following your code. Otherwise, there's deeper ramifications that can occur down the road. Now, if how should I say it? I'm not saying you should just go along with whatever the code says. Because the codes are created by the profession, that's the route you should take. If you have strong disagreements with certain items in your code, you should be changing the code. So within that profession, get actively involved in your profession. That code should be revised on a regular basis anyway, because times change. But I would not, if you're having a conflict between as a member versus within the profession, you should be going along with your code and then change the code if there's something truly wrong with what's in the code.
I like how you highlight the use of the code and in that legal perspective. Where I am, I'm in the U.S. and I'm in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, the state also certifies scientists, and that becomes a state licensure on par with like a septic designer's license or an engineering license. You have to sit a whole test and everything. I have not done that yet, but that then it becomes a more legal ramifications if you're not following that code of ethics, and it's not just the standard being used as a okay, we're going to use this as the general. Then it's a codified this, and I find that overlap fascinating. Um, so I have another question for you guys. Marina, you might be better suited for this one. Uh, I am sure that a lot of people present today have encountered a situation in their career which challenged their individual moral compass or ethics. Could you provide guidance on how to navigate such a situation or best to analyze all the facets in a setting? So you've got a problem. How do you approach this?
Yeah, I think it comes down to some of the things that we mentioned today. Ultimately, as Dr. Sanders was saying, if you're facing this a lot, maybe you're in the wrong profession. But I do feel like that process element that we emphasized before is really important. So if you're encountering different situations where you're facing this, impact on your moral compass versus what you're being asked to do, documenting the process and just being as transparent as possible in the things that are being flagged and are being concerns to you is really important. And again, I would emphasize that being able to rely on professional standards or the code of conduct, as mentioned before, can really help clarify things that seem ambiguous, as it gives you a tangible and objective resource to lean on. So it's not necessarily you that's saying that X, Y, and Z needs to happen. It's a best practice and within, standards and principles that you need to do X, Y, and Z. And I do think another aspect of this is one of the ones that we mentioned in another question is that societies like SWS, like SER, provide members with those networks where they can build relationships and have conversations with peers in the field. So I feel like what Dr. Sanders was saying, you don't want to be alone out in the field by yourself as like a lone wolf or sheep, I guess, maybe is a more accurate depiction of that. But you want to be a part of the herd, and being part of these types of networks can help you have those conversations or foster those relationships in order to, determine if what you're facing, maybe you're not alone in that. Maybe there's others that are facing that or have come across this specific situation and you can lean on them. Again, context specific, you don't want to go spilling all the beans everywhere, but generally, there are opportunities to have those conversations depending on the scope of the issue. And so those are the things that I feel like are important to flag. I think as was emphasized in the question, everybody today probably has encountered a situation like this and they're not alone. But there are things that you can lean on, whether standards or other people that can maybe help make things a little bit less isolating.
That's I appreciate that. We've got a couple more minutes here, and with that time, I'd like to give you guys both the chance, as professionals and individuals. Are there any ethical considerations or questions you would like the group as a whole to ponder, given both your backgrounds with SER and as an ethics professor? and yourselves as people who might eventually be impacted by wetlands or almost directly are impacted by wetlands in your work.
Well, I guess I'll go first on this one. There's two that come to mind. One I have already kind of mentioned briefly, and that is I would challenge individuals to think about how professionals outside of the typical collaborations that are already occurring in your profession could bring value. And previously I mentioned applied ethicists, but there may be others that can bring a robust perspective that's currently not occurring within or around the table or within your networks. The second thing that I would encourage people to think about is how the community can actually be an asset rather than, I know often it's viewed as a hurdle in many of these projects. You know, how do I share this information without them shutting down my project? Or but to shift that particular mindset to how can the community be an asset? You know, how can they be I guess kind of like a member of the table as well, if we think of the entire community as one person sitting, you know, in one chair around the table. Um, as I have engaged in community work, and again, I'm going on my fifth decade now in doing this, every time I work with new communities, I have surprises as to the value and perspectives and things they can bring to a topic, a situation, to accomplish things that seemed undoable without their involvement. They can turn things and flip it on a dime. And some of you may have experienced that in a negative way. It can occur in a positive way as well. So I would encourage you to think about how to basically bring the community as an ally, as a colleague, as a partner in what you're trying to accomplish.
I'll add in some as well. And I love what you said, Dr. Sanders. I think that's really important. So, me myself, I'm not a restoration practitioner. I'm actually a social scientist by training. And what I've been able to bring into this space is a lot of that thinking of, you know, the importance of working with communities and how do you do that responsibly and ethically, and what are the different impacts that can come through that, or the different knowledge systems. So just what you mentioned, Dr. Sanders, I think I've seen myself as really critical for this practice to grow. And so I do think that there's a lot of different aspects out there that can add value to the work that you're doing, and typically might have been seen as like an invisible stakeholder or something like that in the past. And I definitely also challenge you to think about that, because again, my personal experience before I got grounded within this field is that there wasn't necessarily a lot of that informed consent happening, or you know, consideration of the rights of Indigenous peoples and how to work with them, and not just bring them in and be like, this is what we want to do, and we just want you to, you know, have a check mark off on this project. So there's a number of different people in professions, community members that can add different types of perspectives to the work that you're doing. But bringing back to one of the earlier questions, I also think that you should be considering an invisible stakeholder, so to speak, as somebody maybe like 100 years from now, that generational mindset. Consider them in this too, and try and put on that hat of what would they either praise or criticize in the work that you're doing, and is there something that can be taken from that and added into maybe the considerations that you are, you know, balancing in your role, and will that make an impact or shift the direction that you're going? That could be interesting to think about. And then I think the other question that I might challenge you on is that there's a lot of uncertainty in wetland science, or in restoration, or just within that environmental field as a whole. We don't know if a project, like a restoration project, for instance, will succeed, or if a species will adapt, or climate change or anything else that is happening in the world will have a detrimental impact on the work that you're doing. So it's constantly something to think about is how you handle risk as a person, how people in this field handle risk and responsibility. And so I do think that there is never, I think it was in the question that somebody had put in, there's never a binary path that you can take. There's never like black and white. It's always going to be gray, and that's something that you have to live with, I feel like, in this field. It's just the reality. We don't know what's going to happen, and we can't predict it. So how does that sit with you, especially when it comes to ethics? Because you will never have that certainty of if the decision that you are taking or making is right. Um, you'll just have to wait and see.
No. Thank you guys, and thank you both for your time today. This has been huge. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the SWS webinar sponsors, specifically Davy Mitigation, SWCA, Environmental Consultants, and Resource Environmental Solutions. Thank you guys for sponsoring this series. Um, our next upcoming webinar will be how to become a certified wetland scientist or wetland professional on April 16th at 1. We hope everyone can join us then. That's Eastern Standard Time. And then we hope to see many of you at our annual meeting in New Orleans in June. Don't forget to register. Final housekeeping thing, if you want your PWS or Whippet credits, please be sure to complete the survey that'll be sent out after this. And I hope everybody has found this helpful and gets you thinking about ethics in your professional space and how this can impact your work professionally. So thank you, everybody. A special thank you, Maria and Marina. Thank you guys so much for joining us and for your insights.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
You.